Welcome to Daily Report Channel. The fear that Russia has unleashed on the Baltics results in the Baltic states and NATO taking very drastic military security measures. There is a great naval activity in the Baltic Sea at the moment, and the fact that Finnish and Swedish officials said they can officially start the process of applying to NATO increases the possibility of threats from Russia. The best example of this was the Russian Federation sending its troops to the Finnish border, right after Finnish officials announced last week that they were officially considering joining NATO. Subsequently, the Russian Federation strongly warned Sweden and Finland not to join NATO and said that it would deploy its nuclear weapons on Russia's western border. Russia's aggression and the fear it wanted to create in the Baltics, instead of scaring two countries such as Sweden and Finland that attach great importance to neutrality and independence, encouraged these countries to play their biggest trump card against Russia for their security concerns. NATO has launched a new naval operation to maximize security in the Baltics for both Sweden and Finland and the former Soviet countries Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. 4 NATO warships arrived in the Gulf of Finland. The sighting of 4 NATO warships in the Gulf of Finland broke out as the biggest mistake in Russian President Vladimir Putin's plan. No official explanation has been given as to why these ships are in the area. However, it stands out as the strongest claim that they emerged in order to prevent the Russian pressure in the Baltic Sea. The British warship HMS Northumberland emerged in the Gulf of Finland. Danish bander DMS Peter Willemoes, Dutch bander HNLMS de Zeven Provinciën and Germany banderal FGS Erfurt were also seen near the Gulf of Finland. It is stated that these 3 ships entered the bay. The main reason for the presence of these ships in the region is seen as the pressure that Russia will put on the Baltic countries in the event that Ukraine invades. Because it is thought that Russia, which has remained silent, albeit partially, to Finland's attempts to apply for NATO membership, has a solid plan underhand. However, it is also discussed whether Russia, which lost more than 3,000 armored vehicles and tanks in total in the officially announced figures, and at the same time sank its most important flagship in the seas, will dare a new war. But as opportunities ripen, Putin's audacity has become clear on Ukraine. For this reason, large increases are observed in NATO's shipments to the region. When we carefully follow the recent statements of NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg and US President Joe Biden, it can be easily seen that NATO support to Eastern Europe and Baltic countries will be greater than ever before. The increase in the shipment of US warships to the Baltic Sea in recent days is one of the biggest indicators of this support. The moves of the US warships, especially near Kaliningrad, caused a great reaction on the Russian side. Russian media outlets stated that this move was a clear threat to Russia. On the other hand, Russia has suffered perhaps the greatest losses in its history since its invasion of Ukraine on February 24, and this decision will perhaps result in the biggest strategic mistake. On the Ukrainian border, 190,000 soldiers entered the Ukrainian border, and intense fighting took place in many different regions. The occupation, which started with a massive bombardment, later turned into a land operation. Russian President Vladimir Putin's plan was, in his view, flawless. However, how much this plan remained in theory became clear after the heavy defeat of the Russian army against the Ukrainian armed forces. In particular, there was another flaw in Russia's plan that was not visible. It was the uneasiness that the Baltic countries, bordering Russia, would experience. Undoubtedly, Russia's Eastern European aggression has always given security fears to the former Soviet countries and the Baltics. However, this reached its climax with the Ukraine war. What Russia could not calculate as a result of this security threat was probably that these countries took the strictest security measures instead of a more passive attitude out of fear. NATO plays its cards face up against the Russian threat. There is a NATO military presence of almost 350,000 on the border of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. It is clear that this military presence is the result of Putin's plan, which he sees as foolproof. Because when Russia was entering Ukraine, Vladimir Putin made it clear that he did not want NATO on its borders. But before Russia's invasion, NATO had already turned into an inactive alliance and many of its members began to talk loudly about the uselessness of the alliance. As you can remember, the first of these objections was the statements of the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. Addressing the European Union, Macron said that NATO is now dysfunctional and that the European Union must establish its own military force. This was actually the target of French politics for a long time, not just Macron. but Putin did something that made NATO functional again. The value of being a NATO member has increased and the non-NATO countries' perspective towards NATO has changed. NATO is no longer just a community where you send your army to regular exercises. It is a structure that protects countries against the threat of Russia and supports them as a military force. Here is the critical error. It's not whether Ukraine was invaded or not, but Putin's biggest mistake was to reactivate NATO, giving its existence a great meaning. Finland is a leading example in this regard. Recently, Finland decided to start the first serious NATO membership process due to this move of Russia. The attitude towards NATO in the country has changed visibly. In the previous years, in the referendums held for NATO membership, almost every segment of the public was against NATO membership. However, in recent studies, it is reported that this rate is between 50% and 55%. Even if the government makes an official application, this rate goes up to 70%. Finland's official NATO membership initiatives will mean that another Baltic country, Sweden, will enter the same process. Because these countries are countries that determine their destinies with common decisions in general terms. Today, NATO has 9,000 soldiers in Estonia, 9,100 in Latvia and 20,800 in Lithuania. It is also announced that the number of these soldiers will increase. At the same time, efforts are being made to make these soldiers permanent in the region. In other words, we are talking about a NATO force growing under Russia's nose. We are talking about a NATO unit with modernized weapons, warplanes and tanks, unlike the Ukrainian army, whose weapons are from the Soviet era. At this point, NATO's complete security of Eastern Europe, as well as its shipments to the Baltic Sea, has caused Russia to bring what it does not want with its own hands. NATO is now much stronger on the Russian border and is in a position to respond very clearly to a possible Russian attack. Putin, on the other hand, is concerned about putting Plan B into action instead of Plan A, which was defeated in Ukraine. If the troops gathered in eastern Ukraine cannot occupy Kharkiv and then Kiev and lose again, the consequences will be much more severe for the Russian army. With an economy eroded by sanctions and a lost army, Russia's entire weight in the region will disappear and it may be possible to see Russia after the Soviet Union again. Nevertheless, we hope that Russia will not resort to different methods to compensate for the losses it has suffered in Ukraine and to instill fear in Europe or to push NATO away from its borders. Because the methods that Russia will resort to seem to be biological or nuclear weapons. The use of nuclear weapons is currently only seen as a deterrent and a threat. Although the warning made to Finland and Sweden by Russia raises fears that Russia will consider its nuclear options, the real Russia's heavy bombardment of hundreds of Ukrainian settlements after losing the Black Sea Fleet flagship Moskva and the non-civilian bombing to seize Mariupol increases the tension and nuclear fears in the region. We hope that the situation does not turn into a situation where the use of nuclear weapons is seriously considered. We hope that the great powers can deter Russia in such a situation. We hope that Russia will return to peace negotiations by understanding that every country has the right to freedom and an environment of peace can be established in Europe.